He ran a sawmill that had been in his family for 3 generations, and he had never once kept a proper ledger. By the end of her first week he wished she had never walked through the door. That is how I think about men like Owen Radcliffe. They are not stupid men, they are not lazy men. They are men who learned everything from their fathers and their fathers' fathers. And they carry that knowledge in their hands and in their bones. And they believe, they genuinely believe, that the land and the timber and the work itself will tell them everything they need to know. Numbers are for accountants. Accountants are for men who don't trust themselves. Owen Radcliffe trusted himself completely. He had inherited the Radcliffe mill from his father, Burl, who had inherited it from his father, Glenn, who had built it himself on the bank of the Coldwater River in the hill country of East Texas in 1891. 3 generations of Radcliffe men had run that mill on feel and instinct, and the particular squint of the eye that comes from standing in sawdust your whole life. They knew the sound of a blade that was starting to dull. They knew the smell of green wood versus seasoned wood. They knew which crews worked clean and which ones wasted board feet without meaning to. What they did not know, what Owen specifically did not know, was how much money the mill was actually making. Or losing. He would have told you it was making plenty. He would have told you the orders were steady. And the contracts were holding. And the Radcliffe name still meant something in 3 counties. He would have told you all of that with complete confidence. And he would have believed every word of it. Because Owen Radcliffe had not looked at the real numbers in a very long time. The real numbers told a different story. But that story had to wait for Lenora Voss. I should tell you how she came to be there, because it matters. Owen's younger sister Patrice had married a man named Douglas Voss who ran a grain operation out near Mineral Wells. Douglas had died 2 winters before this story begins. A heart attack at 51, quiet and sudden, the kind that doesn't announce itself. When Douglas died, Patrice found herself running a business she had never been trained to run, and she did it badly at first, and then she did it better, and eventually she hired a woman named Lenora, who had a head for numbers the way some people have a head for music. Naturally, effortlessly, with a kind of pleasure that other people found slightly unnerving. Lenora Voss was Douglas Voss's cousin by marriage. 36 years old, unmarried. She had worked for a bank in Fort Worth for 8 years before she decided she was tired of making money for men who couldn't be bothered to say thank you. She left the bank and started consulting, which mostly meant she went into struggling businesses, and told the owners uncomfortable truths. And then they either listened or they didn't. She had been working for Patrice for 4 months. When Patrice mentioned, somewhat carefully, that her brother's mill had not paid its full share of a joint property note in over a year. Owen and Patrice co-owned a strip of timberland along the eastern ridge, their father's inheritance divided between them, and the arrangement was that the mill's income would cover the note on that land while Patrice held the deed for her half. Owen was supposed to send a check every quarter. For the past 5 quarters the check had been short, not by much at first, then by more. Patrice did not want to fight with her brother. She never wanted to fight with Owen. But she was also not in a position to absorb the shortfall indefinitely. So she asked Lenora if she would go take a look. Lenora said she would. Owen said, when his sister called to explain, almost nothing. He said fine. He said it the way a man says fine when he means the exact opposite of fine, when he means I don't need this and I don't want this and I would like to end this conversation now. He said fine and he hung up the phone and he went back out to the mill floor, and he didn't mention it to anyone. Lenora drove out on a Monday morning in early March, when the air still had that raw edge to it and the river was running high from the winter rains. She drove a practical truck, the kind that didn't call attention to itself. She wore jeans and boots and a canvas jacket. She did not dress like someone coming to impress anyone because she was not coming to impress anyone. Owen met her in the yard. He was a broad man, the kind that gets broader with age rather than heavier, with dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that were permanently stained from decades of mill work. He shook her hand once briefly, and looked at her the way men like Owen look at people they have already decided are a waste of time. He said, I can give you the office, the books are in there, I got work to do. Lenora said, that's fine, I'll find you if I have questions. He walked away without answering. She found the office. It was a small room off the main floor, separated from the noise by a single plywood wall that did almost nothing to reduce the sound of the blades. The desk was buried, that is the only word for it. There were invoices stacked in piles that had grown into other piles. Receipts bundled with rubber bands that had dried out and cracked. Contracts tucked into folders that had been tucked into other folders. There was a coffee mug on the desk that had been there long enough to become structural. Lenora set her bag down. She found the ledger. The actual written ledger, because Owen did not use accounting software, had never used accounting software, and considered it with the same vague suspicion he considered most things that had been invented after 1975. She opened it to the first page of the current year. She read for a while. Then she set it down and looked at the wall. She went and found Owen on the mill floor, standing with his foreman, a leathery man named Gil. looking at a section of equipment that had been giving them trouble. She waited until there was a pause. Then she said, I need to understand your contract structure, specifically the pricing on your long-term supply agreements. Owen looked at her. What about them? When were they last renegotiated? He thought about it. 6-7 years back, and lumber prices since then? Up. Obviously, but your contract prices haven't moved, I told you. 6-7 years, she said. Okay, and went back to the office. By noon she had found the first problem. By 3 in the afternoon she had found 3 more. By the time the mill shut down for the day and the last truck had pulled out of the yard, she had a list of 7 separate issues, each one individually manageable. All of them together something considerably worse. She was sitting at the desk with her notes in front of her, when Owen came to the office door, still dusty from the floor, and leaned in the frame. He said, You find what you're looking for? She said. I found more than I was looking for. He came in and sat down across from her, the way a man sits when he's already decided he's not going to like what he hears. He crossed his arms. He waited. Lenora had done this enough times to know there was no good way to soften it. You could try, but softening it only made men like Owen feel patronized, and a patronized man stops listening. She had learned to just say the thing plainly. She said, Your supply contracts are locked at 2017 prices. Lumber's up 38% since then. You're leaving somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 a year on the table, depending on volume. He didn't move. Your blade maintenance schedule. You're running blades about 30% longer than the manufacturer recommends. I found it in your own maintenance log. You're losing board feet to cut variance and you're probably replacing blades more often because of it, which means you're spending more to save less. He said, We've always run blades that way. I know. That's the problem. Something shifted in his jaw, but he didn't say anything. Your drying operation is running about 15% over optimal moisture cycles. That's affecting your grade out rate. You're selling more number 2 when you should be selling number 1. The price difference on that alone, across your annual volume, is probably $20,000 to $25,000. He said, The dryers are fine. The dryers are not calibrated. There's a difference. She kept going. She told him about the fuel costs on his transport fleet, which had gone unrenegotiated for 4 years. She told him about a standing order for a particular grade of raw timber that he was paying a premium for, because the original order had been placed with a supplier who was a friend of his father's, and that supplier had been bought out 2 years ago by a larger operation that had quietly raised the rate without announcement, and apparently without Owen noticing. She told him about the payroll structure for his weekend crew, which had a quirk in it that was paying out at a rate that didn't reflect the actual hours being worked. She laid all of it out, item by item, with the numbers underneath each item. She didn't editorialize. She didn't say you should have known this or how did you let it get this far. She just said, Here is the thing, here is the number, here is what it means. Owen sat through all of it without speaking. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the sound of the river outside. He said finally, How bad is the total? She said, Depending on which problems you fix and how quickly, you're looking at somewhere between $90,000 and $130,000 a year that is either being lost or left behind. Your mill is not in crisis, but it's not healthy either. You've been running on the reputation your grandfather built and the contracts your father signed, and both of those are eroding. He looked at his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, My father ran this mill for 30 years without an accountant. Lenora said, Your father ran it in a different market, and I'd be willing to bet he was losing money at the end too and didn't know it. That landed hard. She could see it land. He stood up. He said, I'll think about it, which was not a thank you, was not an acknowledgement, was barely even a full sentence. He left the office and she heard his boots on the floor outside and then the sound of his truck starting. She stayed and finished her notes. She came back on Tuesday. He wasn't there when she arrived. His truck wasn't in the yard. Gil told her Owen had gone up to the eastern ridge to check on some timber they were considering for the next harvest. He did that sometimes, went up alone, said it helped him think. Lenora said that was fine and went back to the office and kept working. Owen came back around 11. He stood in the office doorway for a moment without saying anything. She looked up. He said, The supplier, the one that bought out my father's friend. What's the name? She told him. He said, I know their regional sales manager, I was at his wedding. He paused. I should have caught that, she said. Yes, he said, you don't have to agree that fast. She said, I know, I'm agreeing because you're right. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not softened exactly, but reorganized. He came in and sat down and said, Show me the blade thing again. She showed him. She walked him through the maintenance log, pointing to the entries, explaining what the variance looked like and where it showed up in the cut reports. He followed it closely. He asked good questions. He knew the machinery. He knew it better than she ever could, and when he understood what she was showing him, she could see the recognition move across his face, the particular frustration of a man who sees something he should have seen a long time ago. He said, My father never measured the moisture cycles. We just ran them by time and feel. She said, that used to work better. Wood composition in the supply chain has changed. More plantation timber, faster growing, different moisture distribution. The old cycles don't account for it, he said. How do you know that? She said, I spent 6 months with a mill in Louisiana before I came to work for your sister. They had the same problem. Took us a while to figure out what had changed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you've done this before. I have fixed mills, fixed businesses, a few mills. He nodded slowly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the maintenance log, but he wasn't really seeing it anymore. He was thinking about something else. He said to, what did you do before this? Patrice said you worked in banking. 8 years commercial lending. Why'd you leave? She said, because I was good at seeing problems and I wasn't allowed to say so. He laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, and she could tell he hadn't meant to. He looked up at her like he was seeing her somewhat differently than he had before. He said, what do we fix first? That question. We was the first word of a different conversation. They started with the supply contracts. Owen called the regional sales manager he knew, the one whose wedding he'd attended, and the conversation was direct and brief and uncomfortable, in the way that conversations are when one person has been quietly taken advantage of, and they both know it. The rate was adjusted. Not all the way to where it should have been, but most of the way. Owen said he could live with it. Lenora looked at the number and said that was reasonable. The blade schedule they overhauled together. Owen brought in Gil, who had opinions, and there was a discussion that lasted most of an afternoon and involved a fair amount of stubborn repetition from all parties. But it ended with a new schedule written on a whiteboard in Owen's hand, which meant he had accepted it enough to write it down himself. Lenora had learned that things written in the owner's hand had a way of getting done that things written in an outsider's hand did not. The dryer calibration took longer. They had to bring in a technician from the manufacturer, which cost money up front, and Owen said so. Lenora said the cost would be recovered in the first quarter from improved grade-out rates alone. Owen said he'd hold her to that. She said he was welcome to. The transport contracts were renegotiated over the phone in a single morning. Owen knew every carrier he used personally, knew their dispatchers, knew in some cases their families. The renegotiations were friendlier than expected. 2 of the carriers said they'd been meaning to bring up the rates themselves. The weekend payroll issue turned out to be a clerical error from 4 years ago that had simply never been caught, compounded quarterly ever since. When Owen saw the total, he went very still. He said, 4 years. Lenora said, 4 years. He said, that's my error. She said, it's a clerical error. Anyone could have. It's my mill, he said. My error. She let it sit. They were working late that evening, the last of the light going orange through the office window, the river sound carrying in from outside. They had been at it for 3 days straight and the list was getting shorter. Owen had coffee going in the corner. Real coffee, the kind made in a percolator that looked like it had been at the mill since the 1970s. He poured her a cup without asking. It was the first time he'd done that. She said, thank you. He said, you drink it black? She said, always. He said, good, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. They worked until dark. Lenora had been staying at a motel in the nearest town, 20 minutes out, and when she started putting her papers in order to leave, Owen said without looking up from the page he was reviewing, Patrice said you're good at this. She said, Patrice is kind. He said, Patrice is accurate. She doesn't do kind for its own sake. He turned a page. She's not wrong about many things. It was not a compliment exactly, but it was something. By the end of the week the framework was in place. Not all the problems were solved. Some would take months, and the dryer calibration was still in progress. But the structure was clear. Owen had it. He understood the numbers now in a way he hadn't before. Not because he'd lacked the intelligence, but because no one had ever sat down with him and made him look at them. His father hadn't done that. His father had kept the books in his own head and passed the mill on with the understanding that Owen would figure it out the same way. The problem was that the world the mill now operated in was not the world his father had operated in, and the gap between those two worlds had been costing him, quietly, for years. On Friday afternoon, when Lenora was packing up to leave, Owen came to the office and stood in the doorway the way he had on that second morning. He had something in his hand, a folded check. He said, this covers your fee and the first quarter's payment to Patrice in full. She took it without looking at the amount. She'd learned that looking at the check in front of the client was its own kind of statement. She said, I'll send you a summary document next week. Everything we covered, the new schedules, the renegotiated terms. He said. All right, she said. The dryer report from the technician should come in by the 15th. You'll want to compare the grayed-out numbers for March against February before I compiled this. He said, I know how to read a comparison. She said, I know you do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the thing you said, about my father probably losing money at the end and not knowing it. She waited. He said, I looked at his books, the old ones from the last 5 years he ran the place. He paused. You were right. She said, I'm sorry. He said, don't be, it's useful to know. He looked out through the office window at the mill floor, empty now, the big saws still and quiet. He was a good man. He knew timber better than anyone I've ever met. He ran it the way he always had, and by the end the world had changed around him and he hadn't. There was something in his voice when he said it. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more like recognition. She said, that's the hardest thing to see. When the thing that built something is also the thing that starts to hold it back. He looked at her, he said, yeah. She picked up her bag. She said, I'll be in touch. He said, Lenora. He didn't say it to stop her. He said it the way you say someone's name when you've been thinking of them one way and you're adjusting. She turned. He said, the mill will be different in 6 months. If you wanted to come back and check the numbers, I wouldn't object. It was the longest way anyone had ever asked her to return. She understood it for what it was. She said, I'll put it in my calendar. He nodded once. She left. She came back in September when the light was different and the river had dropped with the dry summer and the mill was running at a different pace. Steadier, she noticed, more deliberate. Owen met her in the yard the same as before. But this time he shook her hand and held it a moment longer than the first time. And when he looked at her there was none of that flat appraisal in his eyes. He looked at her the way you look at someone you've been thinking about. The numbers were better. Not perfect, they never are, in any operation, but better in the ways that mattered. The grade-out rate had improved 21%. The supply contract was holding at the renegotiated rate. The blade schedule had been followed more or less, with one deviation that Gil had insisted on and that Owen after discussion had allowed. The payroll issue was fully resolved. Owen showed her the comparison himself. He had made a table by hand on graph paper, the kind of table she would have made but laid out in his particular way with his particular shorthand. She read it carefully. She asked 3 questions. He answered all 3 without hesitation. She said, you've been doing this yourself. He said, I had a good teacher. A real one, not polite. He seemed to like that. They had dinner that evening at a place in town that had been there since before either of them was born, with booths made of dark wood and a menu that hadn't changed in decades. They talked about the mill, and then they talked about the timber market, and then they talked about other things, the way people do when they've run out of professional topics, and find they aren't ready to stop talking. Owen told her about growing up at the mill, about learning to walk on the plank floors, and riding the lumber stacks as a small boy, and the way his father's voice had sounded on the floor, carrying over the machines. He told it carefully, the way people tell things they don't usually tell. Lenora told him about the bank, and about the particular loneliness of being the person who sees the problem, in a room full of people who have decided the problem isn't there. She had spent 8 years being right about things in ways that weren't wanted. Coming out here, doing this work, had been the first time in a long time that being right had felt like a gift rather than a liability. Owen listened the way he did everything. Quietly, with his full attention, giving nothing away until he was ready. He said, it's a strange thing, to be good at something people don't want, she said. It's stranger to stop. He looked at her across the table. He said, I'm glad you didn't stop. Somewhere between that dinner and the spring that followed, something shifted in the distance between them. It didn't happen fast and it didn't happen dramatically. It happened the way things happen between people who are both a little wary and a little tired of being wary. Slowly, then all at once, like the river rising after a long rain. By the following March, Lenora had an office at the mill that was her own. Not because she'd asked for it, but because Owen had cleared out the storage room next to his and put a desk in it, and said without ceremony, you can work from here when you're on site. And they both understood it to mean more than that. Her name went on the operational documents first as a consultant, then as a partner in the management side. Owen handled the floor, Lenora handled the numbers. Between the two of them, the mill ran better than it had in 20 years. The Eastern Ridge property note was paid in full the following October, ahead of schedule. Patrice called Owen when the payment cleared and told him she was glad. He told her he was too. She asked him how things were going with Lenora. He said fine. She said she knew that meant good. He said he supposed it did. There is a thing I have noticed about people who are built like Owen Radcliffe. And I've known a few. Which is that their stubbornness is not stupidity. It is loyalty. Loyalty to the people who taught them, to the methods that worked, to the idea that what was handed down deserves to be honored. The problem is that loyalty, carried too far, can become its own kind of blindness. The dead don't need protecting from new ideas, the living do. What Lenora gave Owen was not just the numbers. She gave him permission to let the mill change without feeling like he was betraying the men who built it. That is a harder thing to give than any spreadsheet. And he gave her something too. A place where being right was welcomed. Where seeing clearly was valued. Where the thing she was good at was finally, for once, something someone wanted. Neither of them would have called what they found in that mill office a gift. But that's what it was. I'll leave you with the question I always come back to when I tell a story like this one. Is there something in your life? Some operation, some habit, some way of doing things That you've been running on feel and instinct long past the point where the numbers would tell you something different? Not because you couldn't look, but because looking felt like a betrayal of the person who taught you. Tell me in the comments, I'd like to know.